It is 1964. A Pan Am Boeing 707 is rolling toward the gate at JFK International Airport. The crew steps off looking the way airline crews always look. Sharp, confident, like people who belong exactly where they are. One of them is not what he appears to be. He is 16 years old. He has no pilot's license. He has no flight training beyond what he read in a manual he borrowed from a library. The uniform he is wearing he obtained by telling a Pan Am employee that his was lost at the dry cleaner and he needed a replacement before his next rotation. He has a pilot's ID that he made himself. He has a story for every question anyone might ask. And here is the thing. Nobody is asking. They are holding doors open for him. They are nodding. They are saying good evening, Captain. And he is nodding back, calm as still water, because he figured something out very early that most people never figure out at all. People do not see what is in front of them. They see what they expect to see. Put the right clothes on. Carry yourself the right way. Give them a title and a smile. They will fill in everything else themselves. His name is Frank Abagnale Jr., and over the next several years he will be a pilot, a doctor, a lawyer, and a professor. He will cash millions of dollars in fraudulent checks across the United States and across the world. He will be arrested and imprisoned in multiple countries, and he will do all of it before his 21st birthday. But this story is not really about Frank Abagnale. It is about the rest of us, the ones who held the doors open. To understand how we got here, we need to go back. Frank Abagnale Jr. was born in 1948 in Bronxville, New York. He grew up in a comfortable household. His father, Frank Sr., was a well-liked man, a local businessman, the kind of man who knew people who could walk into a room and make friends without trying. Frank Jr. worshipped him. By most accounts, Frank Sr. returned that affection. They were close in the way fathers and sons sometimes are when the son sees in the father everything he wants to become. Then things fell apart, not dramatically, not all at once. The way things usually fall apart, slowly, a business struggling, money getting tight, and then his parents' marriage crumbling under the pressure of it. Frank Jr. was around 13 or 14 when the divorce happened. He was close enough to both parents that a judge actually called him into the courtroom and asked him to choose which one he wanted to live with. He could not do it. He walked out of that courtroom and did not go home to either of them. He was 14 years old, alone in New York City, and from that moment he was on his own terms. Now, that is a hard situation. A lot of kids have come up harder and not turned to fraud. So the circumstances explain the start, but they do not explain everything that followed. What they do explain is a young man with a particular set of skills he had been developing his whole life without knowing it. Frank Jr. had charm, real charm, not the oily kind that puts people on guard, the warm kind that makes people feel comfortable immediately. He had watched his father use it his whole childhood. He had absorbed it the way kids absorb everything their parents do without ever being taught directly. He also had nerve. That is rarer. A lot of people have charm. Nerve is something else. Nerve is the ability to walk into a room where you absolutely do not belong, feel the discomfort rise up in your chest, and keep moving like it is not there. Most people cannot do that. Frank could. And he discovered very quickly that those two things together, charm and nerve, were basically a skeleton key for the world. His first frauds were small. He bounced checks using his father's account. He figured out early that if you dressed a certain way and carried yourself a certain way, tellers at banks would cash checks they had no real reason to cash. He was a teenager doing this, wearing a suit he should not have had, using language that sounded like an adult, and it worked. Here is where it starts for a lot of people, not in some cinematic moment of deciding to become a criminal, just a small test, a little push against a boundary, and when the boundary does not push back, the next push comes a little easier and a little harder. Frank pushed the boundary all the way off the table. He figured out that the key to all of it was the costume, not just clothes, The whole thing, the ID, the title, the story. He learned that most people, when they encounter someone with the right uniform and the right credentials and the right posture, do not question them. They defer. It is a deeply human habit. We are trained from childhood to recognize authority by how it presents itself. A white coat means doctor. A uniform means pilot. A badge means officer. We are not thinking about whether those things are real. We are just responding to the signal. Frank Abagnale understood that before he could legally drive a car. Let us walk through how this actually worked, because the details matter, not for shock value, because the details show you exactly how ordinary this all was, how human it was, on both sides. The pilot identity came first, and it lasted the longest. Frank had noticed that airline pilots moved through the world in a particular way. Hotels deferred to them. Restaurants seated them well. Banks cashed their checks without much fuss because a Pan Am pilot was about as respectable a customer as a bank teller was likely to see on a Tuesday morning. The uniform did the work. He contacted Pan Am directly, claiming to be a pilot whose uniform had been ruined, and asked about replacing it. They directed him to a supplier. He paid for the uniform out of pocket, a real Pan Am uniform. Then he called Pan Am again, this time saying he had lost his company ID, and through a combination of persistence and that easy, unhurried confidence he had, he eventually obtained enough information to create a convincing replacement. He studied the ID. He studied the insignia. He studied how pilots talked, how they stood, what words they used on the job. He did not actually fly planes. He rode in the jump seat, the extra seat in the cockpit sometimes used for observers or off-duty crew. He deadheaded, which is the airline term for crew members flying on their airline's flights for free when they are not on duty. He did this for years, logging what he said were over 2 million miles across 26 countries, almost entirely as a passenger in a pilot's uniform. The check fraud ran alongside this. He would go to a bank near an airport. He was in uniform. He would explain that he was a pilot, that his wallet had been stolen, or that he was caught in an awkward situation between cities and he needed to cash a personal check. The uniform made the story make sense. The story made the check seem reasonable. The check, of course, was no good. He got very good at reading people during this. He could tell within seconds whether a teller was going to be easy or hard. If someone seemed sharp or skeptical, he would find a reason to move to another line, another window, another branch. He never pushed through resistance. He went around it. Always the path of least resistance. Always the warmest door. Then he became a doctor. This one is harder to believe, and yet it happened. He moved to Atlanta, Georgia. He introduced himself to neighbors as a doctor. This led to a casual social connection with a man who was actually a physician, who happened to mention that his hospital was looking for interns. Frank applied. He used a fake Harvard Medical School transcript he had manufactured. He listed fraudulent references. Nobody called the references. Nobody independently verified the transcript. He was hired as a supervising resident at a hospital in Atlanta. He worked there for nearly a year. Now stop for a moment on that. A man with no medical training, supervising residents, working inside a hospital for nearly a year. How is that possible? Because he did what he always did. He watched. He listened more than he talked. When he did not know something, he said he wanted to hear how the residents would handle it first, framing his ignorance as a teaching tool. He surrounded himself with people who actually knew what they were doing, and he positioned himself as the one evaluating them. When real decisions had to be made, he deferred to others in ways that looked like mentorship. He kept moving. He never stayed still long enough for anyone to pin him down with a question he could not answer. He eventually left when he felt the situation getting too dangerous. He always left before the walls closed in. He became a lawyer next. He passed the Louisiana bar exam. On the third try, but he passed it. He practiced law for a period using a fake Harvard law degree to get into the profession, then passed the actual state bar examination. That detail is important. It says something about Frank Abagnale that tends to get lost in the spectacle of what he did. He was genuinely intelligent. He was a quick study. He could have done real things in the world if he had gone that direction. He chose not to. He also spent time as a professor, teaching sociology at Brigham Young University using fabricated credentials. His students rated him highly. Throughout all of this, the check fraud continued. He became increasingly sophisticated at it. He would print his own account number on blank deposit slips and leave them in the customer deposit slip rack at banks, so that when legitimate customers made deposits using those slips, the money routed to his account. He printed his own checks. He learned bank routing systems. He estimated that he successfully cashed around $2.5 million worth of fraudulent checks during this period, in 26 countries, passing through banks, hotels, airlines, and businesses, who all believed exactly what he needed them to believe. The interesting thing about his method, the thing that really separates it from simple theft, is that he almost never had to force anything. Almost every door he walked through, someone opened for him. Someone saw the uniform and stepped aside. Someone read the credentials and said, "Welcome aboard." Someone heard the story and decided to help. That says something about him, but it says something about us too. We like helping people who look like they belong. We like being associated with confidence and status. And we really do not like asking the question that might make us seem rude or suspicious. So we do not ask. And people like Frank walk right through. Here is the thing about sustaining a lie across multiple identities in multiple countries over multiple years. You can be brilliant at it and it will still eventually break. Not always from the outside closing in, often from the inside, from the weight of it. Frank moved constantly, every few months. Every time a situation started to feel tight, he packed up and became someone else somewhere else. That kind of living takes something out of a person even when the person is very good at it. You cannot get too comfortable. You cannot let anyone get too close. You cannot tell anyone the true story of who you are because there is no single true story anymore. He later described this period of his life as deeply lonely. That is worth sitting with. A man moving through the world as a parade of impressive people, welcomed everywhere he went, nobody really knowing him at all. His operational mistakes when they came were small at first, a check that did not clear cleanly, an employer who decided to follow up on a reference and found a disconnected number. He would be gone before it crystallized into a real problem. But the net was tightening. More jurisdictions were aware of a pattern. The FBI was building a file. Interpol had his name. The thing that accelerates the unraveling for most people in Frank's position is the same thing every time. They stop being quite as careful, not because they get stupid, because getting away with something for a long time starts to feel like evidence that you are going to keep getting away with it. The discipline that kept them safe in the beginning starts to feel unnecessary. The exits they used to map in every room start to feel like extra work for no reason. You see this all the time. The employee who has been skimming the register for 2 years starts taking larger amounts because nothing has happened yet. The person who has been lying to their partner starts getting sloppy with the details because the lie has held so far. Same thing, different scale. For Frank, the mounting pressure came from accumulation. Too many aliases, too many cities, too many fraudulent checks floating through too many financial systems. The infrastructure of his deception had gotten large enough that maintaining it cleanly was becoming harder. He was in France when it finally caught up with him. He had been living in a small town called Montpellier, presenting himself under another name, working a relatively quiet life for once. A former girlfriend from one of his previous lives, a flight attendant who had known him as Frank the pilot, saw him on the street. She recognized him. She also knew by this point that he was not what he had claimed to be. She contacted the authorities. The French police arrested him. And so began a long international process of countries arguing over who had the best claim on Frank Abagnale Jr. and what should happen to him next. He was 21 years old when the French arrested him in 1969. France imprisoned him first. French prisons in that era were not pleasant places, and by multiple accounts the conditions Frank experienced were genuinely harsh. He served time there. Then Sweden, which also had charges against him, extradited him and imprisoned him again. Then the United States brought him home. He was convicted in the U.S. on multiple counts of fraud and sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. He served less than 5 years. He escaped from federal custody twice during this period, which is either impressive or a sign of how chaotic the federal system was at certain junctures depending on how you look at it. One escape involved convincing a guard he was an undercover prison inspector. Of course it did. While he was serving his sentence, the Federal Bureau of Prisons and various federal agencies began to notice something about Frank Abagnale that made him more valuable out of prison than in it. He understood fraud in a way that was genuinely unusual, not theoretically, practically. He knew how financial systems could be manipulated because he had manipulated them. He knew how people's trust could be exploited because he had done exactly that repeatedly, successfully, for years. The federal government released him early on the condition that he would work with them, help law enforcement understand fraud, help banks and businesses identify vulnerabilities. He agreed. He went on to build a second career as a fraud consultant. He worked with the FBI for decades. He built a private consulting practice that worked with major corporations and financial institutions. He gave lectures. He wrote a memoir called Catch Me If You Can, which eventually became a well-known film. And here is where the story takes one more turn that is very Frank Abagnale. In later years, researchers and journalists began examining his claims carefully, and they found significant gaps. Some of the specifics of his story, the exact details of how long he posed as a pilot, whether he truly worked as a physician for as long as he claimed, the precise dollar amounts involved, did not fully hold up to verification. Some former associates disputed specific details. Records that should have existed did not. It is possible that Frank Abagnale, the world's most famous con artist, partially fabricated the story of his own life as a con artist, which is either a stunning irony or the most on-brand thing a man like Frank could possibly do. What is clear is that real fraud occurred, real checks bounced, real institutions were deceived. He served real prison time, and his expertise in fraud consulting, whatever its origins, was considered genuine by the agencies and corporations that worked with him for decades. But the man who built a career warning people about deception may have been deceiving people about himself right up until the end. Some things really do not change. Every person in this story made choices. Frank made his, but there are thousands of other people in this story whose choices mattered just as much. The bank teller who looked at the uniform and decided not to ask the awkward question. The hospital administrator who saw the Harvard credentials and did not pick up the phone to verify them. The neighbor who heard Frank introduce himself as a doctor and decided that seemed about right. None of those people were stupid. They were doing what people do. They were reading the signals they had been trained to read. Uniform means trustworthy. Credentials mean qualified. Confidence means competence. These are shortcuts we all use because we cannot verify everything. We would never get anything done if we did. But shortcuts have costs. And the cost here is that a smart, charming, deeply lonely young man with no real credentials was able to move through the world as whatever he needed to be, for years, because the world kept deciding it did not need to look too closely. The version of Frank Abagnale that people tend to focus on is almost romantic. The young rogue, the smooth talker, the kid who outsmarted the system. That version is entertaining. It is also a little bit of a con in itself. Because the real story is not about how clever Frank was. It is about how much we want to believe in people who present themselves confidently, how much we want to be associated with status and competence, how little we want to be the person who makes a scene by asking the uncomfortable question. Frank Abagnale did not outsmart the world. He understood something true about the world and used it. The truth is that most of us, most of the time, are not really checking. We are accepting. We are deferring. We are extending the benefit of the doubt to people who look the part because it is easier and more comfortable than doing otherwise. That is not a character flaw. It is a human habit, and it is also the open door that every con artist in history has walked through. The question is not whether you have ever been fooled. Almost everyone has been by someone at some scale. The question is what you do with that. The next time someone in your life seems a little too smooth, a little too perfectly packaged, a little too quick to offer credentials you did not ask for, notice that. Real competence usually does not need to announce itself quite so loudly. Real authority usually does not need to wear the costume quite so carefully. Most people are not Frank Abagnale, but most of us have met someone with some of what Frank had. That easy confidence, that answer ready before you finish the question, that ability to make you feel like asking for proof would be rude. Pay attention to that feeling. That slight discomfort you talk yourself out of because everything looks fine. That is usually where these stories start.